Ladies and gentlemen, my brothers and sisters, today I stand before you not as a critic, but as a witness to the resilience of a nation that has walked through fire and still stands tall. The story of India, a land of ancient wisdom, relentless progress, and unyielding democracy, is not merely a national narrative, it is a global lesson. And yet, in the corridors of global perception, something is deeply flawed. A one-sided tale is being told. A lens, clouded with bias, continues to distort the truth. The Western media, once a beacon of objectivity, too often chooses selective storytelling over sincere understanding. I ask you, is it not time for India to rise, not in anger, but with clarity? Is it not time to update the software of global perception, not through retaliation, but through revelation, education, and courage? For the fight is not against the West, but against injustice. The enemy is not a nation, but the narrative of imbalance. Let this be our mission, to hold the mirror of truth high, to remind the world that the voice of 4 billion people cannot and will not be edited to fit someone else's script, because, as I have said before, critical, independent, and investigative press is the lifeblood of any democracy, but it must be just, it must be fair, it must be free of prejudice. Distorted narratives about India in segments of Western media have far-reaching consequences that go beyond mere opinion or editorial slant. These narratives, often shaped by limited understanding, outdated stereotypes, or political motivations, strike at the heart of India's sovereignty by framing its policies, culture, and progress in a misleading light. When global media outlets portray internal matters, be it governance decisions, religious dynamics, or legal reforms, through a biased lens, they inadvertently or deliberately undermine the legitimacy of Indian institutions and the democratic process. Such portrayals reduce a complex, pluralistic society to simplistic binaries that suit external agendas rather than reflect the truth on the ground. This distortion becomes even more problematic when it influences international diplomacy, foreign policy, and economic relations. Investors, governments, and global institutions often take cues from these media narratives, and when the image being projected is unbalanced or negative, it can lead to misplaced doubt, hesitation, or even sanctions. More dangerously, it emboldens fringe voices and external actors to interfere in India's internal matters under the guise of human rights or freedom of expression, while ignoring context, local realities, or India's robust legal framework. At a time when India is asserting itself as a global leader in technology, space, culture, and diplomacy, these outdated or ill-informed portrayals rob the nation of its rightful voice in global conversations. They attempt to frame India's rise through a lens of suspicion, framing progress as aggression and tradition as regression. These narratives do not merely misrepresent facts, they cast aspersions on a sovereign nation's right to define its own identity, policy, and future. When one voice dominates the global media landscape, it creates an echo chamber where truth is filtered, facts are selected, and nations like India are spoken about rather than spoken with. This lack of dialogue and respect is not just disrespectful, it is deeply unjust to the 4 billion citizens who live, vote, speak, and build the future of this vibrant democracy every day. Selective reporting by segments of Western media plays a powerful role in shaping global perceptions, often to the detriment of truth and balance. When events in India are filtered through a lens that highlights only conflict, controversy, or crisis, the world receives an incomplete and often unfair picture. This approach to journalism, where certain stories are amplified while others are ignored, contributes to a form of misinformation that is more subtle but no less damaging than outright falsehoods. By focusing only on isolated incidents of unrest or social tension, and neglecting to report the broader context or positive developments, a misleading narrative is constructed, one that portrays India as unstable, divided, or regressive. This selective coverage does not stem merely from ignorance. It is frequently driven by entrenched biases, ideological leanings, or legacy stereotypes that have long shaped the Western gaze toward non-Western societies. Stories about India's technological advancements, educational reforms, healthcare initiatives, climate action leadership, or democratic resilience often receive little attention. Instead, coverage is dominated by narratives that conform to preconceived notions, poverty, religious conflict, or gender oppression, without acknowledging the immense progress being made in these very areas. Such framing robs the international community of a holistic view and reinforces outdated images that do not reflect the dynamic, evolving nature of modern India. Furthermore, selective reporting affects not just perception, but policy. Policymakers, global investors, and international organizations rely on media narratives to inform decisions. When those narratives are skewed, it can lead to misguided judgments, unnecessary diplomatic friction, or unfair pressure on Indian institutions. The damage extends beyond international audiences. Within India, such coverage can erode public trust in foreign media and foster resentment among citizens who feel their country is being persistently misunderstood or misrepresented. This deepens the divide between Western institutions and Indian civil society, making constructive dialogue more difficult. The consequences are particularly severe in today's digital age, where headlines spread faster than facts and social media, algorithms reward outrage over accuracy. A single misleading report, once shared across platforms, can shape opinions for millions. It becomes difficult to challenge or correct that narrative, especially when the original source carries the weight and reputation of established Western media outlets. The harm is amplified when these outlets are perceived to hold moral authority, even when their coverage lacks cultural sensitivity or local context. Ultimately, selective reporting contributes to a broader ecosystem of soft power imbalance. It ensures that only certain voices are heard and validated on the global stage, while others are sidelined or discredited. It shapes what the world thinks of India without ever truly engaging with India. And in doing so, it denies the global audience a fair and complete understanding of one of the world's most complex and consequential nations. India's extraordinary diversity, cultural, linguistic, religious, and ideological, is one of its greatest strengths, yet it is often misunderstood or misrepresented in Western media narratives. This vast and complex mosaic of identities cannot be captured through a single lens or simplified into binary categories of majority and minority, progress and tradition, secularism and faith. Unfortunately, much of the reporting that originates from outside India fails to appreciate the delicate balance that holds this diverse nation together. Instead of celebrating India's pluralism, some segments of Western media reduce it to a source of conflict or division, portraying diversity as a fault line rather than a foundation. India is home to over 4 billion people who speak more than 120 major languages and follow countless faiths and traditions. In this setting, harmony is not a theoretical goal but a daily reality. Millions of Indians live, work, worship, and grow together across religious and linguistic boundaries. This coexistence, often ignored in global coverage, is the true heartbeat of the nation. When incidents of communal tension or political disagreement do occur, as they do in every democracy, they are too often presented as evidence of deep-rooted intolerance, rather than as part of the ongoing struggle to strengthen a complex, evolving democracy. Such representations do not just lack nuance, they are dangerous. They feed into a narrative that sees India through the lens of perpetual crisis, overlooking the many examples of unity, cooperation, and progress that characterize everyday life. This framing undermines the agency of Indian citizens and paints a distorted picture of societal dynamics. It erases the voices of those who are actively working to build bridges, grassroots activists, educators, interfaith leaders, and ordinary citizens, who contribute every day to the democratic and inclusive spirit of the nation. The failure to represent India's diversity accurately also impacts how Indian policy and governance are perceived abroad. Policies that are designed with regional or cultural sensitivities in mind are often judged by external commentators who lack the context to understand their purpose or impact. For example, a policy aimed at uplifting a specific linguistic or tribal group might be misinterpreted as exclusionary simply because it does not fit into the Western framework of how identity politics should function. Without a grounded understanding of India's internal complexities, such judgments are not only flawed, they are unjust. Moreover, this imbalance of representation perpetuates a sense of cultural superiority where Western models of democracy and human rights are held up as universal benchmarks, while Indian approaches are subjected to disproportionate scrutiny or condescension. It ignores the fact that India has managed to uphold democratic institutions and protect diverse communities under far more challenging conditions than many in the West could imagine. The resilience of India's democratic framework, the vibrancy of its civil society, and the depth of its cultural tolerance deserve to be acknowledged, not dismissed or overshadowed by selective stories of division. In global discourse, representation matters. When India's diversity is misrepresented or underrepresented, it is not just an editorial oversight. It is a denial of the lived reality of millions. Accurate, respectful, and balanced coverage is essential not only for justice and dignity, but also for building international relationships based on mutual understanding and truth. Media bias has far-reaching consequences, and one of the most critical areas it influences is geopolitical trust. In the interconnected world of today, perceptions matter just as much as facts. When Western media continuously portrays India in a negative or skeptical light, often without adequate context or balance, it creates a trust deficit that affects how nations interact with India diplomatically, economically, and strategically. These biases seep into policy discussions, international negotiations, and global collaborations, framing India not as a reliable partner, but as a subject of scrutiny and suspicion. Over time, this fosters an environment where India's intentions are second-guessed, its leadership is questioned, and its global contributions are undervalued. This erosion of trust is particularly troubling because it occurs not due to India's actions on the world stage, but because of how those actions are reported or interpreted through a biased lens. For example, India's assertiveness in defending its national security or interests is often portrayed as aggression, while similar actions by Western powers are labeled as necessary or prudent. India's efforts to protect its digital sovereignty, ensure cultural integrity, or manage internal security, challenges are sometimes reported as authoritarian or ultranationalist, without the same nuanced understanding granted to Western democracies facing comparable issues. Such framing feeds into a narrative that paints India as unpredictable or incompatible with liberal global values, when in reality, India operates with a strong commitment to democratic institutions and pluralism. The result of this imbalance is a loss of credibility in international relationships. When global leaders and institutions absorb these biased portrayals, it influences their attitudes and decisions. Strategic partnerships may be approached with hesitation, investments may come with added scrutiny, and collaborative opportunities may be missed simply because of how India is perceived rather than what India actually represents. Trust is a fragile currency in international relations, and it can be easily diminished when the media projects a skewed version of reality. The irony lies in the fact that India has consistently shown itself to be a stable, responsible global actor. It has maintained peaceful diplomatic ties with a vast range of nations, contributed significantly to UN peacekeeping efforts, taken leadership roles in climate negotiations, and offered humanitarian assistance across continents. India's approach to multilateralism is inclusive and constructive, grounded in the belief that development, peace, and prosperity must be shared. Yet, when this consistent track record is ignored in favor of isolated controversies or sensational headlines, the world loses sight of the bigger picture. Furthermore, biased reporting can sow seeds of mistrust among Indian citizens themselves, particularly when they observe global media consistently undermining their country's progress. This can lead to a sense of alienation and skepticism toward international media institutions, weakening the soft power relationships that could otherwise build bridges across cultures. In the long term, it also creates an uneven playing field where India must work harder to prove its legitimacy or intentions, while others are given the benefit of the doubt without question. In matters of geopolitics, trust is not built solely on diplomacy or trade. It is also shaped by the stories nations tell about one another, and those stories are, in large part, driven by the media. When those stories are biased, incomplete, or unbalanced, they do more than just damage reputations. They distort reality and undermine the foundation of mutual respect upon which true global cooperation is built. Empowering indigenous media to become a strong global voice is essential if India wants to challenge biased narratives and establish a fairer, more representative information landscape. For far too long, international perceptions of India have been shaped predominantly by Western media outlets, many of which operate with limited context, selective focus, or inherent ideological leanings. These platforms often act as global gatekeepers of information, framing stories in a way that aligns with their own cultural, political, or economic perspectives. This results in the marginalization of authentic Indian voices and a disconnect between how India sees itself and how it is seen by the world. To correct this imbalance, India must invest in the growth, credibility, and global reach of its own media institutions. This doesn't just mean building more television channels or digital platforms, but creating journalism that meets the highest standards of accuracy, ethics, and professionalism, while also remaining rooted in Indian realities. India has no shortage of talented journalists, content creators, and storytellers. What they need is greater support, strategic vision, and a global platform to tell their stories without being filtered or reframed by foreign editorial biases. These indigenous voices can present India not only as a functioning democracy, but as a civilization with depth, vibrancy, and intellectual richness. By promoting its own narratives through robust and independent institutions, India can create a media ecosystem that stands tall on the world stage, not as a counter to the West, but as a peer. A strong indigenous media can tell the stories that Western outlets often miss or misinterpret. The grassroots innovations in rural areas, the cultural exchanges between communities, the social reforms led by ordinary citizens, and the nuanced complexities of India's political debates. These are stories that reflect the true spirit of India, and they deserve to be told without dilution. Digital technology and social media offer powerful tools for this transformation. With smart strategy and global engagement, Indian platforms can become global influencers, reaching diasporas and international audiences with original content that challenges stereotypes and builds cultural bridges. India's growing soft power in cinema, music, yoga, philosophy, and literature already gives it an advantage. What's needed now is a structured effort to amplify these assets through credible, globally respected media institutions. These platforms should be multilingual, inclusive, and able to present the Indian perspective on international issues with authority and intelligence. However, empowerment must also come with responsibility. Indian media must strive to rise above sensationalism, partisanship, and internal biases that can weaken its credibility abroad. It must champion journalistic integrity, protect freedom of expression, and maintain editorial independence, while staying conscious of the role it plays in shaping national and global consciousness. Only then can it become a true alternative to the skewed representations that currently dominate international discourse. This is not merely about national pride. It is about ensuring equity in the global flow of information. When only a few voices control the global narrative, democracy itself is at risk. A world where Indian stories are told primarily by none, Indians cannot do justice to the complexity of the nation. By empowering indigenous media, India reclaims its voice, not through confrontation, but through creation, not through censorship, but through clarity, and most importantly, by ensuring that the story of India is told by those who live it, understand it, and believe in its future.